Ben was with Rook talking about something as they were walking around some shops, and Rook questions was it not traditional to pick out a trinket of some sort, to which he answers that he's got that already picked out. He just hopes that things go their way tonight and asks Rook if he can handle that without him today. Rook tells him that if he is in need of any backup, he will call for Alpha Squad and Magister Max before resorting to calling for Ben, because of how important tonight is to him, as he'd read up that this sort of thing was meant to be a very important day to humans and he wouldn't want to be the cause for interruption. Ben thanks him for that, as he'd honestly admitted tonight was going to be a bit difficult for him because he was nervous about everything going right, with the trouble that had been caused recently, especially since that Billy kid had almost ruined it by turning them into kids earlier. Glad they cleared that up quick. His Ravonagander partner then asked if he'd made all the proper preservations for tonight, to which Ben says that he'd managed to get lucky with that since they'd had an opening they could fit them in. It being one of the less expensive places made it one of the less busy, thankfully, as the people always wanted the more expensive places first and worked their way down. Rook asks what all he is planning besides that, and Ben says he's gonna try his best to recreate that night, as his partner says that he hopes he doesn't try to recreate that head injury he'd also gotten that night as well. Though Ben says he'll try to leave that part out, he just wanted it to be right. Nodding in understanding, Rook says that he has a girl back home that he feels the same way for, and Ben asks Rook to tell him about her, to which he says that her name is Rayona, and she is very beautiful, and he often misses her, which is why he was looking forward to the Harvest Festival time. Ben listened to that and reminds Rook that he was going to need to educate him on the proper ways to conduct himself around his family, if he was gonna go to that thing to meet his family, since he didn't want to make a fool of himself. Rook says not to worry, as it would be easy enough to teach him, as Ben seemed to be a fast learner when it came to picking up the do's and don'ts of other cultures. Seeing the time, Ben then heads back to the house, seeing that Gwen wasn't there yet. As he walked inside to get cleaned up and changed, the Ship was playing with an empty box, having knocked it over and crawled inside, curious about what was inside of it, and he laughs, telling Ship there's nothing in there. Ship looks up at Ben, barking his name, wanting to know what was in the box, as he shows them a box that had a pretty dress in it, which Ship sniffed at before turning away from, going to play with a robot toy instead, since he wasn't interested in clothing stuff, just like to play with technology. Ben then went and showered, getting cleaned up and preparing himself for the night's events, as Gwen had shown up just as he'd finished getting ready. She then came on in, and Ben asked how her friends were. She says fine, but she'd almost lost track of time. Let her shower and change, then they could go. He agreed to that, since the reservations were set for a slightly later time, and they'd had a decent amount of time for her to get cleaned up and get ready, then get to where they were supposed to be going tonight. He was really glad Gwen's college had an extended weekend because some egghead destroyed the science wing mixing the wrong chemicals. Thankfully, from what he'd heard, no one was hurt. Gwen got out of the shower and began to dry off as she asked Ben where he had planned for tonight, given what tonight was and all, and he says he's got something in mind, but he didn't want to spoil it. All he did tell her was it was going to be special, and that didn't really help. Every anniversary was special. Ship jumped up and down wanting to go, but Ben tells him he's got a special job for him to do. He needs them to guard an important package until they get back, to which Ship nods and sticks close to the package Ben had showed him, not knowing what it was, but was told it was important. The two locked the door as they then headed out and proceeded to get into Ben's classic ride instead of the one he'd gotten for doing plumber jobs, and they'd driven off to go out for dinner, just the two of them. Where Ben was taking her, that was a secret until they got there, though she hoped it was somewhere wonderful. The two pulled into a nice place where they did valet parking, and Gwen began to recognize the place as they were going inside. It was nice, but not really too overly fancy. More a quaint, nice place. Actually, this place was starting to seem important the more she looked around. Soon her memory was jogged enough she could remember and smiled, turning to Ben. Gwen then asked Ben if he'd brought her back to the same place they had their first date at, and he smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck before telling the person behind the desk that they had a table for two reserved under Tennyson, and they'd started checking their reservation booklet before nodding. Telling them to please follow them, they'd taken them to their table and said that their waiter would be there shortly, as the two began to chat together about various stuff, the good old days, what Gwen was learning in college, Ben's new aliens, so on and so forth. The waiter then showed up, giving them a menu. The two actually had a really great time there at the restaurant, just catching up and talking about old times together. In enjoying the food and generally just getting to relax. Ben then paid the tab, leaving a nice tip for the waiter, and they'd headed on out as the valet went and got Ben's car, bringing it to him, and they headed on off. Gwen says that was a lot of fun, and Ben tells her that the night's not over yet as he pulled into the park for the two of them to relax and enjoy the cool night air and enjoy a walk under the stars together. Getting out, they then headed towards the middle of the park, enjoying the moonlit walk, with Gwen resting her head on Ben's shoulder. The two of them get over to the center of the park and see the old wishing fountain was still there, and Gwen asks Ben if he remembers that. He says that he does, as she was trying to get her wish to the top of the fountain so it'd come true, and she'd slipped, so he grabbed her and hit his head against the side of the fountain while she landed on top of him as he'd laughed. Gwen pouted, remembering that part, as they'd went to sit on the bench together, and Ben laid down using Gwen's lap as a pillow, with her gently stroking his hair, telling him he still got a small scar from the stitches. She could see it. Ben smiled softly and says that there was a reason he'd wanted to recreate their first date tonight during their anniversary. Holding up a box in one hand high enough she could see it, he opens it up and we can see a beautiful black gold colored ring embedded with emeralds in the side and a large emerald stone where a diamond should be in the shape of a heart, and Ben asks, "Gwendolyn Nicole Daniels, will you marry me?"